All right, so you sent over this French video, 5 unstoppable signs to recognize depression. And wow, it's intense. But does it really live up to the hype? What do you think?
Well, it definitely grabs your attention, that's for sure. And I think that's kind of the point. It feels like the speaker really wants to shake us out of these common misconceptions we have about depression.
Yeah, totally. And they get right to it, tackling 2 big myths right away. First up, depression is a weakness. How do they address that one?
Head on. They basically dismantle that idea completely. The speaker, they emphasize that depression can happen to anyone, no matter your background, your personality, anything. It's not about being flawed. It's not a sign of weakness. They actually compare it to telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. It's like, come on.
Ouch, yeah. That analogy really drives the point home, the absurdity of it all.
Exactly. And that leads perfectly into the second myth they go after, this idea that you can just snap out of it if you just have enough willpower.
Which, of course, is another one of those things people say that's totally unhelpful.
The worst. And the video does not hold back. They compare it to telling someone with cancer to just like think positive thoughts and poof, they'll be cured. It's a bold comparison, but really effective. It shows how depression is a medical condition and it needs real treatment, just like any other illness.
Yeah, no messing around there.
Hmm.
And speaking of powerful statements, did you catch that line about depression being like a cancer of emotions?
Oh,
It's a bit jarring, honestly, but it really does create this vivid picture in your mind.
totally. I mean, comparing it to cancer, it emphasizes just how pervasive depression can be, how destructive. It eats away at you, at your sense of self, your energy, your capacity for joy.
It really does feel all-consuming, like you're trapped, helpless even.
Exactly. And they use another really powerful analogy to capture that feeling. Quicksand. That sensation of sinking deeper, losing your footing, and just not seeing a way out. It's chilling, but it rings true for how depression can feel.
Definitely. So we've established this isn't just a case of the blues, right? This is serious stuff. But how do we tell the difference? I mean, the video seems to focus on drawing a line between just feeling down and actual clinical depression.
Right, and it's a critical distinction. They really separate those everyday ups and downs, which are totally normal, from the persistent, all-consuming nature of depression.
Yeah, and I thought it was really helpful how they even gave us this practical benchmark. If you've been feeling down for more than 2 weeks, it's probably time to reach out for help.
Which is such crucial advice. Early intervention, it's so key when it comes to treating depression effectively.
Absolutely. And they get into the different types too, right? You've got mild, major, chronic, even bipolar disorder.
Uh-huh.
But they do seem to place a particular emphasis on mild depression.
Yes, and I think that's very intentional. Mild depression is the most common form and thankfully the most treatable. So by focusing on this type, I think it gives people hope, encourages them to seek help sooner, before things potentially escalate.
Right? Like, hey, this is serious, but it's not the end of the world. There's help available, and you can recover. Okay, so we've got a grasp on what depression is, how it's different from just having a bad day or week. But how do you actually spot it? The video gets really specific, listing 9 major symptoms. Do we need to go through all 9? Feels a bit like textbooky.
You're right, just listing symptoms can get a little dry. Maybe it's better to highlight a few key ones that people often misunderstand or even try to hide, like inappropriate guilt, for example. You don't always connect guilt with depression right away, do you?
Not necessarily. You might just think, oh, I feel guilty, I must have done something wrong. But as the video explains, with depression, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Exactly. They talk about how people with depression often blame themselves for things that are totally out of their control. They carry this weight of guilt that's just not rooted in reality.
And that can be so isolating because you might not even feel comfortable talking about it, seeking help, because you feel like it's your fault, like you're flawed.
Absolutely. The speaker even points out how this feeling of guilt, it can become another barrier to getting better. It traps you in this cycle of self-blame and inaction.
Wow, so it's like adding another layer to that quicksand analogy. The guilt just makes it that much harder to pull yourself free.
And it's important to note that this guilt can manifest in really subtle ways, right?
Yeah.
It's not always about some big dramatic event. It can be as simple as feeling guilty for needing to rest, for not being able to keep up with social plans, or even just for feeling sad in the first place.
So how do you tell the difference then? Between regular guilt and guilt, that's a sign of something more serious.
That's where self-awareness is so important. honest self-reflection. Ask yourself, is this guilt proportionate to the situation? Am I being way too hard on myself? And if the answer is yes, well, it might be a sign that there's something deeper going on.
So we're talking about these like really heavy, often hidden symptoms of depression. It makes you think about how much we probably miss just going about our daily lives.
And that's exactly why recognizing these less obvious signs is so crucial. You know, the video talks about some of the more well-known symptoms too, like persistent sadness, that kind of bone-deep fatigue. But I thought their take on sleep disturbances was particularly interesting.
Oh, for sure. They didn't just brush over it with a, you might have trouble sleeping. They really got into the nitty-gritty of what that actually looks like for someone struggling with depression.
Totally. It's not just tossing and turning for a bit, right? The speaker described people who literally cannot get out of bed for days, just completely weighed down physically and mentally.
It's almost like that feeling of being like paralyzed that you can get with grief,
Yeah.
but it just lingers.
Yes, exactly. And it just highlights how deeply depression affects every part of you, you know? Thoughts, emotions, energy levels, everything.
And speaking of which, remember that term they used? Psychomotor changes? I feel like they kind of glossed over that one.
They did. It is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? It basically refers to changes in your physical movements and reactions.
Right. Okay, so what does that look like in a practical sense? Give us an example.
Imagine trying to have a conversation, but it feels like your brain is just stuck in slow motion. You're struggling to process what the other person is saying, and your responses feel sluggish, delayed.
I've totally felt that before, especially when I'm super stressed or overwhelmed.
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, someone with psychomotor agitation might feel really restless, agitated, like they can't sit still. They might pace, fidget, or even speak really rapidly, even if there's no obvious external reason for it.
Wow, so it can go both ways then. Just shows how complex depression really is.
It really does. And it underscores why getting professional help is so essential, you know? Because a trained therapist can help you understand these symptoms, figure out what's really going on, and get you the right treatment.
Absolutely. And on that note, I do think the video does a great job of empowering listeners to actually take that first step, to seek help. I love that they provide that 21-question test to assess your risk of depression.
Me too. Knowledge is power, right? The more you understand your own experience, the more empowered you are to get the support you need.
100%. But I have to say, while I think the video does a great job of explaining the individual experience of depression, I did find myself wanting more. You know, like, what about the bigger picture here?
You mean the societal factors that can contribute to depression? Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting.
Exactly. I mean, they mentioned stressful life events as potential triggers, which of course is true. But they don't really delve into all the broader cultural and societal things that could be playing a role in this cancer of emotions, as they call it.
And there are so many. I mean, we live in a world obsessed with hustle culture, right? We're constantly bombarded with messages about achieving more, earning more, being more.
It's true. Like, we're all supposed to be on this treadmill of achievement, going and going and going. And if you slow down,
Or, God forbid, get off.
forget it. Suddenly, you're not enough.
Yeah, you're made to feel like a failure. And then people wonder why rates of depression and anxiety are going through the roof. Right.
Right. It's like we're being trained to chase this perfect ideal of happiness, but nobody wants to talk about the stuff that actually makes people happy, or at least content,
Yeah,
you know, or how the world we live in can make that so much harder.
exactly. It's like we're all swimming upstream against this current. And then people have the nerve to be like, just try harder, swim harder. It's like, no, this is different.
So where do we go from here? The video does a great job, I think, of raising awareness, giving people tools to deal with depression on an individual level. But it does feel like to really tackle this, like they said, this cancer, we need to look at the bigger picture.
100%. It can't just be about teaching people to manage depression on their own. We need to create a world that actually supports mental well-being from the ground up.
Okay, so what does that look like? Give us some concrete examples. How do we actually do that?
Well, I think it starts with questioning, challenging those deeply ingrained cultural norms, right? Like this constant pressure to be productive, to be achieving all the time.
Which, easier said than done, I think, right? I mean, that's like embedded in everything.
It is. But I don't think it's impossible to shift. It starts with those small acts of resistance, setting boundaries, prioritizing self-care, allowing yourself to rest without guilt.
Yes, and making it okay to talk about mental health, too. The good, the bad, the ugly.
Exactly. Create spaces where people feel safe to say, hey, you know what? I'm struggling without feeling judged for it.
But it's bigger than just individual actions, too. It feels like we need systemic change as well, right? I
Yeah.
mean, better access to mental health care, for one thing.
Absolutely. That should be a given, a right, not a privilege. But also looking at all the systemic inequalities that we know contribute to higher rates of depression and other mental health issues, especially in marginalized communities.
It's about making a world where everyone has what they need to not just survive, but to thrive, no matter who they are, what their background is.
Right. And it all goes back to that idea we keep coming back to. Mental health, it's not just a personal responsibility, it's a collective one. We all have a role to play in building a world that prioritizes well-being for everyone.
That's just an important point.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, the thought I keep coming back to is this. What if, instead of viewing depression as this sign of weakness, we started seeing it as a sign that something has to change, not just within ourselves, but in the world around us?
Right. What if it's a wake-up call? A reminder that we're all in this together and we all deserve a world where we can truly thrive, not just survive. And that fighting for that world, that's a fight worth having.
I love that. Such a powerful note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking the tough questions and keep fighting for a better, more compassionate world.